Boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos a esta nova sessão das Lisbon Lectures in the Humanities. Hoje temos o grande prazer de acolher a professora Christine Korsgaard, a quem já vou cumprimentar, mas antes queria cumprimentar os meus colegas de mesa, o professor, e agradecer em primeiro lugar ao professor Arnaldo Espírito Santo, presidente da FLUL, que torna estas Lisbon Lectures possíveis, e também ao apresentador da conferencista, o professor David Horst, justamente também da nossa faculdade. E finalmente, como já fiz na sessão anterior, na conferência anterior, agradecer ao fundador das Lisbon Lectures, aqui, que eu já tinha visto, aqui presente, o professor Miguel Taman, e dizer a todos que, evidentemente, do ponto de vista desta direção, as Lisbon Lectures são um sucesso total e, portanto, são para continuar, e vemos-las também como uma forma de comunicação, não só uma forma de afirmação da Faculdade de Letras no panorama das humanidades, como também a nível nacional, uma forma privilegiada de comunicação do sistema universitário português com o melhor que se faz a nível mundial nas várias áreas em que a Universidade de Lisboa, e neste caso a Faculdade de Letras, trabalham, na área da linguística, na área da história, na área da literatura, ou, como é o caso hoje, na área da filosofia. So I would like to thank to Professor Christine Korsgaard for being with us today. We are going to benefit a lot from her wisdom, because I think she reached a level that surpasses thought and encounters and meets a more metaphysical level, which is in a sense wisdom. And so I want to greet her warmly and thank her for being today with us in Lisbon. Thank you very much.
Vamos ouvir de seguida o professor Dr. David Horst, da Faculdade de Letras da Universidade de Lisboa.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker for the Lisbon Lectures in the Humanities, Professor Christine Korsgaard. Okay. I'd like to begin this brief introduction by sharing how I first encountered Korsgaard's work as an undergrad student in philosophy sometime in the early 2000s in Berlin. I was taking an introductory course on Kant's moral philosophy, and we were assigned to read his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Despite our best efforts, my classmates and I really struggled with the text. Our problem, it was not just the complexity of Kant's arguments that posed a challenge. Our problem was actually more basic. Even though we were all native German speakers, we just couldn't make any sense of Kant's German. His sentences seemed to go on forever, stretching entire paragraphs, if not pages, and sometimes with the sheer overwhelming number of subordinate clauses. Our professor, a native German himself, then offered us a surprising solution. He told us that the secret, or that the key for any German to understand Kant was to read him in English. The English language, he explained, just doesn't accommodate Kant's famously long sentences. So translators were forced to break his sentences down into more manageable chunks. This, he promised, would make Kant's ideas far more accessible. And so I went out and bought the English translation of Kant's groundwork, and my professor was right. Reading Kant in English did really help. But what was even more helpful and more illuminating was the introduction to Kant's moral philosophy that came with the translation. And that introduction, as you might guess, was written by none other than Christine Korsgaard. It was that introduction, along with some of her other papers on moral philosophy, that really unlocked Kant's ideas for me. It transformed him from an obscure 18th century thinker with difficult German into a philosopher whose ideas and arguments I felt were clearly and directly relevant to a wide range of pressing moral issues. Now, I didn't go on to become a Kant scholar, but the lasting impact of that first encounter with Korsgaard's work was that I got really interested in philosophical questions regarding agency and normativity. And these are the very questions I still work on today, and for which I still turn to Korsgaard for insight and guidance. Christine Korsgaard is without a doubt one of the most distinguished moral philosophers of our time. She's the Arthur Kingsley Porter Research Professor of Philosophy at Harvard University, where she taught from 1991 until 2020. Prior to Harvard, she taught at Yale, the University of California at Santa Barbara, and the University of Chicago. She also held visiting positions at Berkeley and UCLA. She earned her PhD from Harvard in 1981, where she studied under John Rawls. Over the past 30 years, Korsgaard published several highly influential books and numerous papers that have shaped and continue to shape the debate in moral philosophy and adjacent areas like philosophy of action, political, and legal philosophy. In her first monograph, Sources of Normativity, published in 1996, Korsgaard sets out to explore the questions that in one way or another have been guiding her work ever since. Where do moral norms get their authority from? Why are they binding? What is the source of their normativity? In this early book, Korsgaard approaches these questions by examining 4 historically influential accounts of moral normativity. She shows how each of these accounts can be understood as a response to its predecessor. And she ultimately argues for a modified version of the Kantian account. According to that view, moral obligations ultimately arise from our nature as reflective agents, that is, as agents who possess the capacity to reflect on and decide the question of what to do. Her second book, Self-Constitution, Agency, Identity, and Integrity, ties together ideas about action, self-identity, and moral obligation, this time drawing not just on Kant for inspiration, but also on Aristotle, in particular, his theory of the good. The guiding thought of that second book is that individuals constitute themselves as agents through their choices and actions, and that this process of self-constitution requires acting according to moral principles. In this way, Korsgaard claims that moral norms are essential to maintaining our integrity and our identity as human agents. Now, in her most recent book, Fellow Creatures, Our Obligations to the Other Animals, Korsgaard deploys the Kantian view of morality that she developed over the previous decade to offer an account of the moral obligations that we human beings have towards non-human animals. She argues that sentient animals have moral claims on us simply because, like humans, they are creatures for whom things can be good or bad. The book is a powerful challenge to the idea that human beings are superior to other animals and calls for a radical reassessment of the way in which we treat non-human animals. Now, there's one key idea in Korsgaard's work that I'd like to explore in a little more detail here, an idea that has been extremely influential in recent debates in moral philosophy and beyond. And this is the idea that certain fundamental practical norms, including moral norms, are grounded in our very nature as agents. The aim of this so-called constitutivist strategy is to explain the normative force of practical principles by showing that they are constitutive of human agency itself. Now, this may sound rather abstract, but as Korsgaard herself points out, the general idea of constitutive standards, it's actually quite familiar from a very wide range of ordinary human activities. So, for example, take playing chess. Part of what it is to play chess, arguably, is to be subject to the standard of playing well. Insofar as you're engaged in playing chess, your performance is assessable as good or bad, depending on how well it promotes the goal of checkmating your opponent. In this sense, playing chess is an activity that has its own normative standard built into it. And Korsgaard argues that human agency, in a sense, is analogous in this respect. When we engage in the activity of choosing and acting, we're governed by standards of choosing and acting well. And these standards are not imposed externally, but are internal to the very nature of agency. To act at all is to commit oneself to these standards, standards that Korsgaard ultimately goes on to identify with the hypothetical and categorical imperative. So in this view, moral norms owe their authority to the fact that they are partly constitutive of what it is to be an agent in the first place. Of course, we often fall short of these standards, but the point is that when we do, we fall short as agents. Much like making bad chess moves reveals someone as a poor chess player. Now, the analogy with chess certainly has its limits. You can opt out of a chess game, and by doing so, cease to be committed to the game's constitutive standards. But with agency, there's no opting out. As Korsgaard puts it at one point, human beings are condemned to choice and action. So since we cannot opt out of agency, the norms constitutive of agency are, in a sense, inescapable. And this is what gives moral norms their unconditional character. They apply to us regardless of our personal preferences or inclinations. And part of the reason why Korsgaard's constitutivist approach has had such significant impact on contemporary moral philosophy is that it provides a powerful and elegant response to skeptical challenges about why we should follow moral norms. Rather than appealing to external reasons or incentives, the constitutivist approach suggests that moral obligations arise from our very capacity to act. Simply by acting, we commit ourselves to standards of acting well, so that when we fail to live up to these standards, we fail at being what we are, human agents. Now, with that, I won't take up any more of our time, and please join me in welcoming Professor Christine Korsgaard.
Thank you all very much. There is a handout. I hope you all have a copy. I won't be referring to it directly very often. I will occasionally, but you'll find that you're able to follow along with what I'm saying if you look at it. Now, the question that I'm going to address in the paper today is the very old question of how a human being ought to live, or what a good life for a human being is. Now, many people would probably say that the best life for a human being is a happy one, but we're not going to take that for a satisfactory answer, in part because we don't have a clear picture of what happiness is, and in part because the word happy is often used almost as a synonym for whatever it is that makes life best. So I'll ask you to set that answer aside. In the first section of the paper, I'm going to start by sketching some of the more common ancient and modern philosophical views on this question, and making some remarks about the way the question has been approached. Now, it is a very ancient question, one that goes back almost to the beginnings of philosophy. Very early in Plato's Republic, Socrates says, "We must now examine whether just people also live better and are happier than unjust ones. This argument concerns no ordinary topic, but the way we ought to live." The work of the Republic is to argue that justice is an integral part of the good life for a human being. According to Plato, Justice is an organization of the soul which makes the soul morally virtuous. So Plato's question is not only what the human good is, but whether it includes justice, and in general includes moral virtue as one of its essential parts. I'm not going to rehearse Plato's argument here, although I will be reverting to the question later, but Plato argued that it does, that justice is part of the good human life. Now, British philosophers throughout the modern period, from Samuel Clarke at the beginning of the 18th century to Henry Sidgwick at the end of the 19th, took themselves to be asking the same question as Plato had asked when they asked whether moral virtue is in our interest or not. But most of them thought of morality as something that is, as Sidgwick himself put it, harmonious with, but distinct from, self-love. So for them, the connection between morality and the object of self-love or self-interest was either an instrumental relation, morality promotes your self-love, or a harmony between two separate things. Now, John Rawls in the 1970s was asking a superficially similar question when he asked whether the sense of justice is among the human goods, or at least if it's among the human goods for those of us who live in a reasonably just society. But Rawls was arguably closer to Plato because he was more careful to explain that he was asking whether the sense of justice should be valued as an end for its own sake, not merely something we should value as a means to some independently given set of ends or interests. He did not assume that morality or justice is something distinct from the object of self-love, but instead asked whether a person who sought his own good would choose justice for its own sake as part of that good. But to return now to the ancient Greeks, perhaps the most comprehensive classical treatment of the topic is the one we find in Aristotle. In the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle tells us that the choice is between what he calls the three prominent kinds of life, which are a life of pleasant amusements, a political life, or a contemplative life. And he offers us two pretty good arguments for sorting through the three options he gives us. First, he lays down some plausible characteristics that he thinks the best life for a human being must have. The aim of that life must be some activity which we can spend time doing. The activity itself must be inherently pleasant, and engaging in the activity must be a final good, something that's valued for its own sake alone. Now, that last criterion is especially stringent as Aristotle understands it, because as Aristotle understands it, in order to be a final good, it's not enough that the activity is one that we would choose as making our lives worthwhile given the imperfect conditions of human existence. That is, given that we have needs to satisfy, problems to solve, and a social nature that makes us need other people and them need us. Instead, it would have to be one for the sake of which we would choose life or existence itself, and so one for the sake of which we'd be willing to take on all those problems. Aristotle says that it would have to be an activity which would intelligibly make life worth choosing for a god. Now, Aristotle finds all three of his characteristics, activity, pleasantness, and final goodness, to be most fully realized in the life of contemplative activity, but also to be realized to some extent by the political life. So he argues that the contemplative life is best, the political life is second best, but the goodness of a life focused primarily on pleasant amusement is a delusion. Pleasant amusements, he tells us, are useful as recreation, but they should not be our central goal in life. And they are certainly not the kinds of finally valuable activities for the sake of which we would choose to exist. Aristotle's second argument is that a human being must fulfill the human function. Now, I think that this often criticized argument is much better than most philosophers have thought that it is. I've defended it in the past, and it'll be the center of what I have to say today. So I'm going to come back to it a little later on. Now, at first glance, it looks as if there are some problems with Aristotle's argument. The two arguments that I just described are used to identify which of the three prominent types of lives is the best. But Aristotle tells us little about where these three candidates come from, except that they are prominent. And to modern ears, they sound rather distressingly specific. The life of amusement sounds like the life of a playboy or a playgirl or somebody who goes to parties and eat, drinks, and be merry. The political life sounds like the life of someone who holds political office or who works for such people. And the contemplative life sounds like it might be the life of a philosopher, a scientist, or perhaps a mystic of some sort. But where does that leave the lives of most of us? The lives of craftspeople and business people, of teachers and doctors and nurses. From a quick glance at the web, I learned that most human beings on the planet are farmers, although in the United States, where I live, the most common occupation is salesperson. Now, are the lives of these people not even candidates for the good life? Maybe your life would not be a good human life just because you're a salesperson. But if it's good, honest work that makes good use of your talents, and you have a loving family and friends on whom your influence is benign, couldn't your life be a good one? Does the best life have to be devoted to some activity that you would engage in even if you didn't have to make a living, or for the sake of which you would choose to exist even if you were a god? Now we'll come back to those questions. Now I'm going to take a quick look at views that have been common on this issue in more recent times. So we're going to make a huge stride forward to recent times. In an appendix to his book, Reasons and Persons, written in 1984, Derek Parfit asked this, and this passage is on the handout. What would be best for someone, or would be most in this person's interests, or would make this person's life go for him as well as possible? And then he replies to his own question. On hedonistic theories, what would be best for someone is what would make his life happiest. On desire fulfillment theories, what would be best for someone is what, throughout his life, would best fulfill his desires. On objective list theories, certain things are good or bad for us, whether or not we want to have the good things or avoid the bad ones. Now, let me just say a word about what these views are. I mean, as the word hedonistic suggests, most people who accept the hedonistic theory take happiness to be roughly equivalent to pleasure. So that life is usually thought of as one in which an individual tries to maximize the sum of his pleasures. I suppose the idea of desire fulfillment is clear enough. It's a life in which you get what you want. But I should mention that variants of the desire fulfillment theory exist that focus on the desires you would have if you were rational or well-informed rather than on your actual desires. Now, the objective list theory might be a little more alien to those of you who are not privy to recent discussions of well-being. Parfit explains it this way, and this again is on your handout. According to this theory, certain things are good or bad for people, whether or not these people would want to have the good things or avoid the bad ones. The good things might include moral goodness, rational activity, the development of one's abilities, having children and being a good parent, knowledge, and the awareness of true beauty. The bad things might include being betrayed, manipulated, slandered, deceived, being deprived of liberty or dignity, and enjoying either sadistic pleasure or aesthetic pleasure in what is in fact ugly. Now, Parfit doesn't tell us how something finds its way onto the objective list. But since his own list, the thing I just gave you, appears to be derived from G.E. Moore's account of the good in chapter 6 of Principia Ethica, it's almost irresistible to say that it's supposed to be a matter simply of our intuitions about what is good. because that's how more thought we can tell which things are good. In any case, in an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy written on well-being and last revised in 2021, Roger Crisp assures us that this threefold distinction has become standard in contemporary ethics. So we may take that to bring us up to modern times. Now, Parfit's views might seem in one way to have an advantage over Aristotle's, namely that the kinds of life he identifies as possibly good or best are not quite so specific and contain a subjective reference that may be helpful. Maybe which life is best for you depends on what gives you pleasure or what you desire. But of course, we could construct a less specific version of Aristotle's view. We could argue that the best life must be one in which you're actively involved in and enjoy yourself by engaging in some activity that's finally good, without granting that the only such things are political and contemplative activity. We could even pick up the subjective reference in Parfit's options by making it some activity that you think is finally good and that you enjoy. And eventually, as you'll see, I'm going to say that that's a pretty good answer. But in any case, I'm unhappy with Parfit's options for two reasons. First of all, I find Parfit's first two options to be disappointingly trivial. Could philosophy's long search for the summum bonum really yield the answer, the good for a human being is getting all the stuff that you want? Or the good for a human being is having a really fun time, for instance? And although the kinds of things on Parfit's objective list may sound plausible enough, just making a list and declaring the items on it to be objectively good things doesn't seem to be like anything but an exercise of personal authority. And in fact, and this is my second reason for objecting to Parfit's set of options, Parfit's whole list really seems to have the same problem that the objective list theory does. It has no basis except intuition. Why should the life of pleasure or desire fulfillment be candidates for the human good? The supporters of these kinds of lives mostly just think it's obvious that pleasure and satisfaction of desire are things that make life good. And in fact, now that Parfit's options have been declared to be the main contenders, the defender of any one of them often argues for his position simply by pointing out its advantages over the other two. I propose in this paper to treat the question in a different way, one that I claim is more systematic. I'm going to approach the question of the human good by asking what we mean in general when we talk about something's being good for something. And then eventually, I'm going to apply the result to the human case. This, as we'll see, is in fact what Aristotle is doing when he raises the question of the human function. So now I'm going to go back to Aristotle. Okay, but here more specifically is the plan. What we're going to do now is talk about what it means in general for something to be good or bad for something, in the sense in which things can be good or bad for entities of almost any sort. Then we're going to look at the more specific question, what it means for something to be good or bad for a living organism. Then we will consider what it is for something to be good or bad for a specific kind of living organism, namely an animal. And finally, we'll look at what it means for something to be good or bad for a specific kind of animal, namely a human being, a rational animal. And that, I claim, will tell us what the human good is. Now, in Nicomachean Ethics 1.7, Aristotle famously attempts to identify the human good by applying a view about what it is to be good or bad for any kind of thing. This is what he says, and this passage is on the handout. Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good is a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or any artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. Well, so it would seem to be for man, if he has a function. Now, both Plato and Aristotle associated the idea of the good with the idea of something that has a function, as many philosophers after them have done. To say that something is a good X, they believed, is to say that it has the properties that enable it to perform its function or to perform it well. A good car is safe and gets good gas mileage because the function of a car is to enable people and their goods to travel safely and efficiently. A good teacher is knowledgeable and patient because the function of a teacher is to convey the material to those who may not immediately understand it. A good watchdog is fierce and loyal because the function of a watchdog is to guard our master against intruders. All of these things have properties that make them good at what they do. Plato and Aristotle called those properties virtues. A virtue, an arete in Greek, is by definition a property that makes you good at your function. Now, of course, those conclusions are about what makes something a good X, not about what's good for an X, but we'll come to that presently. The examples I just gave, I think, are not bad, but they can give rise to a problem. They encourage us, I think, to identify Aristotle's word ergon, translated function, with purpose. And at least in Aristotle's hands, that is not exactly what it means. To understand the point, we have to take a look at some ideas from Aristotle's metaphysics. Aristotle argued that everything, that's every substance, whatever, can be seen as having what he called a form and a matter. The matter is the material or the parts of which it's composed, and the form is the way the parts are put together, which is what makes it the kind of thing that it is. In particular, the form is the arrangement of the parts considered as enabling the thing to perform its function. So, for instance, we might say that the matter of a house is its parts, a roof, walls, windows, and doors. We impose some form on these parts by establishing certain relations between them. We line the walls up corner to corner. We put the roof over the top. We insert the door into one of the walls so we can go in and out. It's these relations that enable the house to serve its function, which, let's say, is to serve as a shelter for people and their goods. If the parts were arranged differently, suppose we just lean the roof against the side of the house instead of putting it over the top, the building could not function as a shelter because the rain would come in through the hole that would be left where the roof should have been. When we understand how the correct arrangement of the parts enables the thing to serve its function, then we know its form. Now, Aristotle sometimes identifies the form of a thing with its function, and he understood the form of the thing, as I've just indicated, as the proper object of knowledge of the thing. To know a thing is to know its form. That doesn't mean that he neglected the matter of the thing, because each type of matter considered in itself is a substance of its own right with a form of its own. And to understand a kind of matter is to know in turn its form, to understand how the arrangement of its parts enables it to do whatever it does, including enabling it to serve as an appropriate matter for making other kinds of things. This is, in fact, an easier thing for us to talk about than it was for Aristotle. For nowadays, we would probably identify the form of a kind of matter with its molecular structure and the capabilities that follow from its having the structure that it does. So putting all this together, an architect, that is someone who understands the form of a building, would know, for example, which of the walls has to serve as a weight-bearing wall if the building is to remain upright, And if he understands his materials, he would know what sort of matter that wall has to be made of, if it's to hold the weight that a weight-bearing wall in that particular building must hold. So Aristotle's identification of a thing's form with its function, and both of them as an object of knowledge, make it clear that by function, he doesn't merely mean a thing's purpose. After all, I know perfectly well that the purpose of a building is to shelter and protect people and their goods, but I don't know where to put the weight-bearing walls or what they have to be made of in order to bear the needed weight. I'm not an architect or an engineer. So by the function of a thing, Aristotle means not just its purpose, but the way the thing functions or the way it works, its functioning. As I put it elsewhere, he means not just what it does, but how it does what it does. Consider a complicated machine. Such a thing might have many purposes, but in the sense I'm discussing now, it has only one function, one way of functioning. So for instance, your computer serves a variety of purposes, things as different as word processing, solving mathematical problems, connecting you to the internet. But to describe its function in this more complicated sense is to describe the mechanisms that enable it to do all these things and the way that the mechanisms enable them to do it. Specifically, we might say that the function of the computer is the electronic storage and retrieval of information according to a program or something like that. But in the strict sense, only someone who actually understands how computers work can tell you what their function really is. That is, can tell you how they do what they do. Or to take another example, you could say of a radio, that it's among its purposes is to broadcast music and live entertainment, provide a medium for advertisement, keep people up to date on the news, and serve as an early warning system in an emergency. Those are all what it does, purposes. But if we want to talk about how it does what it does, we would have to talk about transmitting electromagnetic waves of certain frequencies and rendering them audible, and about the mechanisms that make that possible. The various things the device does are its purposes. The second thing, how the arrangement of its parts enables it to do those things, that's its form or function. Now, for my purposes today, there are two important points to all this. One is, if something has a function, that thing can be good or bad of its kind, because it can have or lack the properties that enable it to serve its function. And even more importantly for our purposes, it follows from the way in which things with function can be good or bad, that things can be good or bad for them. Conditions and activities are good or bad for a thing when they tend to maintain or promote its ability to serve its function. If something has a function, the properties that enable it to perform its function well are the properties that make it a good one. And the conditions that tend to promote and protect those properties are good for it. So things with functions, by their very nature, have a good. They are the sort of entities for which things can be good or bad. Okay, that was the story about what goodness for a thing in general is. Now we're going to talk about what's good for a living organism. The things I've just been saying are clear enough when we're talking about artifacts, tools, inventions, and the materials from which we make them. Things which are adapted or created by people in order to serve some function. But what about living things? Most of us think they were not made to serve a function. Aristotle, however, taught us that it's possible to regard living things as having a function, which is identified as maintaining their own forms. So you might think of it this way. Living organisms are made of fragile materials that are constantly being used up as energy or worn out or damaged in other ways. But organisms constantly take in new materials from the environment, mostly through the nutritive process, and turn those materials either into energy or into fresh parts of themselves, thus keeping themselves, at least for a while, in existence. In other words, they transform food, water, minerals, and elements into their own energy and parts. An organism, a living organism, is always in the process of wearing out and always in the process of reconstructing itself. Furthermore, living organisms also make new things like themselves, things with the same form as themselves, through reproduction. So Aristotle observed that we can explain a great deal about living organisms if we view them as objects that have them a function of maintaining their own forms in these two senses. They maintain themselves in existence as individual members of their kind by keeping their forms from falling apart, and they maintain their species by producing new members of their kind with the same forms. Now, when we view an organism as a functional object in this way, then it's like any other functional object. We can see the activities, objects, and conditions that enable it to perform its function, to stay alive and reproduce, as things that are good for it. So just as the whetstone is good for the knife and high-quality gasoline is good for your car, so we can say that rain and sunshine are good for the plants, and fresh air and exercise are good for both you and your dog. But there's an important difference between organisms and artifacts. Although we're getting better at producing machines that are in various ways self-maintaining, generally speaking, a knife doesn't sharpen itself, and a car doesn't seek out the best quality of gasoline. But a living organism does do things like that. So there's something special about the way living organisms function, which is by tending to their own capacity for well-functioning, by looking after it. In fact, unlike a car or a knife, that is an organism's function. Its function is to maintain its own mode of well-functioning, or its own and that of its offspring. And that's really all that organisms do. They look after themselves and their offspring, and so keep themselves and their species in existence. So an organism's function is more or less to continue functioning in the way that it's characteristic of her kind, and nothing more. Her function in that sense is simply to be what she is. Now, notice, too, that what makes an organism the kind of organism that it is just its own particular way of functioning. Although scientists can presumably talk about these things with much more sophistication and detail than I can, there's not much that I can say about the function of a daffodil or a porcupine, except that the function of a daffodil is to keep functioning in a daffodil sort of way, and a function of a porcupine is to keep functioning in a porcupine way, and to reproduce the porcupine way of functioning in other animals. But a scientist who really understands what those ways are would be able to give substantive explanations of why the daffodil and the porcupine do what they do and how they work, how what they do enables them to keep functioning. She would be able to explain, for instance, that the porcupine seeks out certain nutrients because he needs them to grow his quills, which he uses to defend himself. And that's a causal, not a rational, because. Now, when we look at organisms in this way, we see them as beings for whom things can be good or bad. And that's what we're doing when we say that the rain and the sunshine are good for the plants. We mean that the rain and the sunshine are helping the plants to maintain those properties that enable the plants to perform their function, which is simply to stay alive and reproduce as the kinds of things that they are. So the property of being good for an organism is the same as the property of being good for an artifact. It is the property of helping the thing to function well and to maintain its own way of functioning. All right, but suppose all of that does follow if we consider organisms to be functional objects. with the function of maintaining their own forms. We can still ask, should we regard organisms in that way? And it's often argued that we shouldn't, that there's something unscientific about attributing a function to an organism. Functions don't exist in nature, it will be said. Now, I can't give this point the full treatment it requires here, but I'm going to indicate what I think. And there are two important things to say. First, I've claimed that a function is not just a thing's purpose, but its way of going about doing whatever it does. So attributing functions to things is not quite like attributing purposes to things. It is less obvious that a thing doesn't have a function in the sense of a distinctive way of doing whatever it does than it is that the thing wasn't made for a purpose. However, and this is the second point, I don't think that that argument is completely decisive. In order to attribute a function to an organism, we do have to have a fixed view about what sorts of things it does, and that isn't a question that's quite settled by scientific facts alone. Science doesn't really have a view about whether you digest your food in order to remain alive or in order to use up resources, or whether you reproduce in order to keep your form in existence or in order to provide food for other organisms, say. What you're doing does depend on why you're doing it, because action is subject to a standard of success and failure that invokes the purposes for which it's done. Now, I believe that in order to identify things like maintaining your form or continuing to exist as an organism's function, you have to take on the point of view of the organism itself. It's from the point of view of creatures organized in a certain way, organized so as to seek out and enjoy the things that promote their own continuing existence and that of their offspring, that things can be regarded as the purpose for which they function. I don't think this is a problem for the argument, because I think it's only from the point of view of such creatures that anything can be said to have a good. I've argued for this elsewhere, and I'm not going to try to rehearse the entire argument today. But the main idea is that the normative concepts we're working with here, including that of the good, are perspectival concepts. They're things that exist from the point of view of creatures who act with ends in view, or who act for the sake of certain ends. Just as, say, color is a perspectival concept because colors only exist from the point of view of beings who have color vision. Philosophers have a tendency to talk as if the idea of a purpose is fancifully transferred from artifacts that are made for purposes to living organisms that are not. But actually, something like the reverse is true. The idea of a purpose has its original home, not in artifacts, but from the point of view in which we engage in action. It's transferred from living organisms that do things for ends to the artifacts themselves. Living organisms have a function from a point of view that's given by the nature of living organisms themselves. Their nature is to try to keep being themselves. All right. Now we've looked at what goodness is for a thing in general and what goodness is for a living organism. For a thing in general, it's being in the conditions that make the thing good at performing its function. For a living organism, it's being in the conditions that enable it to maintain its own form, because maintaining its own form is its function. Now we're going to talk about what goodness is for an animal. And here things get a little more complicated. We've seen that to be good for an entity is to help that entity maintain its way of functioning. We've also seen that on an Aristotelian view, the function of a living organism is simply to be the kind of thing that it is, to have the form that it does. Sharpening is good for a knife because it enables the knife to cut, which is its function. Sunshine is good for the plants because it enables them to make plant parts for themselves, and so to keep on being the plants that they are, which is a plant's function. In both cases, what's good for the thing is whatever enables it to function in whatever way it does. But perhaps this doesn't quite seem to capture the sense of good for that we have in mind when we say that something is good for an animal. Remember, what we're looking for here is a sense of good for that, when we apply it to human beings, will tell us what the good life for a human being is. When we say that something's good for an animal in that sense, we seem to be thinking about something that makes the animal's life and experiences welcome or positive from the animal's own point of view. To put it in a slightly circular way, we're thinking about something that makes her experience of her life good. A romp with a frisbee might indeed be good for your dog in the same way that sunshine is good for the plants. It exercises her muscles and helps her keep her healthy, and that helps to maintain her canine way of functioning. A romp with a frisbee is healthy for a dog, but a romp with a frisbee might also be good for your dog in the sense that it's fun for the dog, and at first glance, that might seem like a different kind of good for. Again, to be slightly circular, in order to be good for an animal in that sense, an activity or condition has to be something that makes the animal's experience good or welcome from the animal's own point of view. Or at least it has to be appropriately related to something that makes the animal's experiences good from the animal's own point of view. For instance, something that will make her well if she's sick. That is what animals, or at least makes animals, or at least most of them, different from plants. They experience their lives. They are conscious, they have a point of view, and whether their lives are good for them depends on whether what they experience is experienced in a positive way. All right, now what I've just done is distinguish what appear to be two different ways in which something can be good for an animal. Let's say roughly, and with admitted circularity, that to be good for something is to have a positive impact on it. The two senses I've distinguished are having a positive impact on the functioning or health of the animal and having a positive impact on the conscious experience of the animal. If you think that these are two completely different senses, you will now probably also think that I've been talking about the wrong one all along. Well, it's certainly true that having an impact on an animal's health is standing in a different relation to the animal than having an impact on the way the animal experiences its life. But I think that most philosophers misconstrue the relationship between those two relations. That is, the relationship between improving an animal's functioning and making the animal's experiences good. I'm just going to use the word health for well-functioning here because it makes things simpler. Many philosophers think that health is a good thing for an animal in the sense that it makes the animal's experience of her life good, but only because they think there's some contingent or causal connection between health and whatever makes your experiences good. I believe that this is how the other contemporary theories of the good life that we looked at earlier regard the matter. If you're a hedonist, you think that health is ordinarily a cause of pleasure, or at least that it makes you capable of pleasure, or at least that it's a hindrance to pain. If you go in for the desire fulfillment theory, you may think that most people do, in fact, as it happens, desire to be healthy. If you're an objectivist theory, you may think that health is among the conditions that's objectively good for a person, whether he wants it or not. And of course, according to all these theories, you need a reasonable amount of health to stay alive and fit to achieve whatever else the theory says is good. But I think that way of looking at things misses an important aspect of the connection between these two senses of good for. It misconstrues the connection between good experience and good functioning. And to see why that's so, we just have to think about what an animal is. An animal is a living organism, so her function is to maintain her own form. But being an animal who moves through her environment guided by conscious perception, she maintains her form, at least in part, by representing her environment to herself through her senses, and then by acting in light of those representations, her perceptions. She's guided by the way she perceives things to get the things that are good for her and avoid the things that are bad for her, in the functional sense of good for and bad for. Now, in order for an animal's perceptual system to do its work in this way, perception has to have what I call a valenced character. That means that the things the animal encounters in her environment, the conditions she finds herself in, and the activities in which she engages, all have to strike her as either attractive or aversive, welcome or unwelcome, pleasant or painful, depending on whether they're good or bad for her in the functional sense. That's why she experiences pleasure and pain. She has to be drawn by the way things appear to her to seek out the activities and conditions that are good for her and to avoid the ones that are bad, in the functional sense of good for and bad for an organism. She may not get this right all the time, but if she does not get it right in general, she won't survive at all. Now, what that shows is that for an animal, having good experiences is not merely contingently or causally connected to good functioning. It's part of good functioning. It's constitutive of good functioning. A well-functioning animal feels good when she's in a good condition and enjoys the things, including the activities, that contribute to the goodness of her condition. She couldn't survive if she didn't. So it's not that her organism is in a good, healthy condition, and that's one thing, and that her experience of life is good, and that's another, because of some contingent or merely causal connection between health and the experienced good. Rather, she's an organism that lives and looks after herself consciously. And a positive state of consciousness is not just an effect, but is also constitutive of functioning well. So what I'm claiming is that an animal's enjoyment of her life is, in one way, a perception or awareness of her good functional condition and what will promote it, but it's also an essential part of that condition. It's not merely a sensation caused in her mind by her good condition, but a constituent of well-functioning. She wouldn't be able to function unless she experienced healthy things as good and unhealthy things as bad. And that part of what it is to be healthy is to experience healthy things as good and unhealthy things as bad. Although I can't give an adequate argument for it here, I believe that the view I'm rejecting right now is one of the many delusions of dualism that still haunt philosophy. It misconstrues the relation between the psychological and the physical as a causal relation between two separate things. We can describe the constitutive connection from either direction. To the extent that well-functioning has a good impact on your conscious experiences, you are in a good functional condition. And to the extent that you're in a good functional condition, your life will be enjoyable. To put it bluntly, it's part of the function of an animal to enjoy her life. That's how she does what she does. But let me try to put this one other way, see if I can get it across. Sometimes when we're trying to convey the idea that we sense ourselves to be in a good condition, we say that we really feel alive. Now, I think that is literally true. An animal in a good condition feels her life. She feels herself living. And that very fact is what enables her to live and go on living in the way that animal does. So good experience is an essential part of her functional good, not just an effect of it. Okay, now we've seen what's good for an animal. Now let's turn to the case we're after, the question of the human good. First, I claim that everything I've just said is also true of human beings. Since a human being is an entity, what's good for us is what enables us to perform our function. Since a human being is a living organism, it's the function of a human being to be what he or she is, in the sense that we're in the business of maintaining our own forms. Since a human being is an animal, we function in part by enjoying the things and activities that are good for us in the sense of healthy, and being pained by the things and activities that hinder it. Now, a moment ago, I imagined that you might resist my argument because you might think that having good experiences is only causally connected to being in a good functional condition, and having good experiences is what you think we really ought to be talking about. Now I'm imagining that you might resist my conclusions for a different reason. After all, it will not have escaped your attention that what counts as a good life for an animal on the view I've promoted is basically for the animal to lead a healthy life of the animal's kind. So you might wonder whether I'm claiming that the long-sought answer to the question, what is good for a human being, is simply that it is to lead a healthy life of our kind, to survive and reproduce in the characteristically human way. Earlier, I criticized some of Derek Parfit's options for being too trivial, but now my own view may seem to you to be even worse. The good life is just the healthy life. Actually, however, I don't think this is a disappointing answer when we think about what's specifically involved in human health and human survival and reproduction. Now, to show you why, I need to resort to Aristotle again. In his book on the soul, Aristotle asserts that there are three forms of life corresponding to what he called three parts of the soul. At the bottom is a life of basic self-maintenance, a vegetative life and nutrition and reproduction common to all plants and animals. Animals are distinguished from plants by being alive in a further sense, given by the joint powers of perception and action. The third form of life described by Aristotle is distinctive of human beings. It's the life of rational activity, the life of what he called prohairesis, or choice. Okay, now let's think about the difference between those last two stages. A non-human animal's life is mapped out for him in a general way by his instincts. And any two members of a given species basically live the same sort of life, unless the differences are biologically fixed, say by age or gender or by kinds, as among bees. A human being has a life in a different sense from this, an additional sense, because a human being has and is capable of choosing what we sometimes call a way of life, or following John Rawls, a conception of the good. So rationality introduces a whole new sense of life, a new sense in which a person can be said to have a life. And as we'll see, it's the healthiness of life in this new sense that makes the human good so different and so much more complicated. Now, to show you why, I'm going to put all of this in slightly different terms than Aristotle did. The new terms are that each form of life comes with a new form of identity. A plant, although alive, is still just a something, an entity. Because an animal is conscious of her own existence, a sentient animal is a someone, where by that I mean a more or less unified physical and psychological being with a point of view. But a human being is a someone in an additional sense. Because a human being works out his own conception of the good and lives according to it, each human being has what I have elsewhere called a practical identity. Now, your practical identity consists of the roles and relationships in terms of which you value yourself, in terms of which you find your life worth living and your actions worth undertaking. You may identify yourself, for instance, as a student or a teacher or a lawyer or a political leader. You may identify yourself as someone's mother or daughter or best friend. You may identify yourself as an environmentalist or a conservative or a supporter of labor or the military. Some of these descriptions, such as mother and daughter, apply to the other animals as well. But for you, these are all normative categories. You do things for reasons, and you draw your reasons from these practical identities, from these roles and relationships. Now, the possession of practical identity gives human life a distinctively normative dimension. Although when people list the differences between human beings and animals, they don't often mention this one. But I think this is one of the biggest differences between human and animal life. Animals do not judge themselves normatively. We do constantly. And the fact that we identify ourselves in normative terms is the reason. And I'm not talking just about morality and virtue here. We take ourselves to be good or bad, interesting or dull, attractive or repulsive, successful or failures. Your practical identity sets requirements and standards for you, and you judge yourself to be good or bad, a success or a failure as a person, when you think about how well or badly you meet those standards. It's because we have this additional form of identity that human life is a life governed by values and standards, not just a life governed by desires and instincts. While the lives of the other animals, or so I believe, are not normatively governed in this way. Because the human good involves the construction of a practical identity, an essential part of the human good is to make something worthwhile, something of value, of yourself. It is to construct a practical identity that allows you to value yourself, and to value yourself positively when you live up to the standards inherent in that identity. So human health involves the successful construction of a practical identity which enables you to put a positive value on yourself. And you need to do that because you will put a value on yourself one way or another. There is, however, also a complication, and this makes the human good more complicated. Any animal has a good which consists of her own well-functioning as the kind of animal that she is. If she's a social animal, that good will consist of the things that make her socially as well as physically fit, and a well-functioning member of her group or community. Human beings have a natural and social good of this kind as well, of course. It's good for us to be physically and mentally healthy in the ordinary way, and it's good for us to have friends and to operate well as members of our families and communities. But it's also an essential part of human well-being that we construct a practical identity for ourselves. For us, flourishing consists both in flourishing as human social animals and in flourishing in the particular practical identity that you've made for yourself. Now, the complication is that those two things can come apart. Suppose, just to take an example, that you're a scientist and you find yourself on the brink of making what you think will be a really important discovery. In order to have a good chance of actually making this discovery, you must devote yourself to it in ways that will come at the expense of your achievement of the natural human good. Maybe the work will make you unhealthy or will involve withdrawing from certain community or family ties. But things have worked out for you so that you just can't forget about the chance of making this discovery and still think well of yourself. Your chance to make your life something really worthwhile rests in doing this. Now, in these circumstances, you must value your good as a human animal against your good as the particular person you've made of yourself. And one of them may lose out. So the human good has two parts, which can come into conflict with each other. I don't believe there is any set way of resolving these conflicts. Rather, I think that because we're autonomous creatures who are involved in the construction of our own good, it's up to us to decide how we will resolve them. That's part of what counts as determining our own individual conception of the good. Now, of course, there's more to say, lots more, but for now I must conclude, so I'm going to make short work of a few remaining points. Plato and Rawls wanted to show us that morality or justice is essential to the human good. The conclusion I've reached is a little short of that. I haven't argued that what's good for us rests in moral value, or indeed in any value that we necessarily share with others. I haven't rejected a connection between the human good and more widely shared values or moral values, and in fact, I believe in such a connection. But I've left those issues to be settled by further arguments. But I have argued that because our specifically human nature involves having a normative conception of ourselves, the human good rests not just in finding our condition desirable, but in valuing ourselves and living in accordance with our own values. Thinking well of yourself is essential to having a good human life. In the case of a non-human animal, Aristotle's theory of the good as resting in the maintenance of your form includes reproduction. Some of you may be wondering what becomes of that idea in my account of the human good. Well, I'll just gesture at the fact that the reproduction of practical identity is in a way the business of education and culture more generally. I don't think that having biological children is necessarily part of the human good, but I think that making some contribution to the continuing existence and application of the values inherent in your practical identity is. This is all rather obvious to professors of philosophy. We teach our students to value systematic thinking in the way that we do it in hopes of propagating an essential feature of our practical identities in future people. This desire to reproduce our own practical identities is one of the reasons it's hard to resist the idea that a value, in order to be a value at all, must be shared with at least some other people. Values by their nature extend into a future that carries you beyond the limits of your temporal self. Now, since my account of the human good is focused on living up to your own values, you may also wonder what becomes of the idea of enjoying yourself or being happy in my conception. I have argued that a well-functioning animal necessarily enjoys doing the things by means of which he takes care of himself, eating the right things, getting enough sleep and exercise, staying clean and comfortable. In the same way, a well-functioning human being necessarily enjoys doing the things by means of which he lives up to and realizes the values he set for himself. In both cases, his awareness of himself, of his own life, is to that extent a pleasant one, and his life is a good thing from his own point of view. In both cases, of course, this enjoyment partly depends on external conditions. So the idea here is just that in choosing and working out your good, you go for making something valuable of yourself, and to the extent that you succeed at it, to that extent, you're happy. So when a human life is good, it's not because it happens to cause pleasant sensations, or because you desire it, or because you believe it to be among the human goods. It's good for him, for a human being, for the same reason that anything is good for any conscious being. Because when a human being lives up to his own values, he's both functioning well consciously and conscious of his functioning well. So now I'll end by reminding you of the conclusion that I set out to prove, that good for in the human case means the same as it does in every other case. What is good for you, if you're any sort of entity, is to function well. What is good for you as a living organism is to function well at being the kind of thing that you are. What is good for you as an animal is to function well consciously at being the kind of thing that you are. And what is good for you as a human being or rational being is to function well consciously in your practical as well as your natural human identity. So to say that something is good for something means the same thing in every case, including the human case. We have only to recognize what is distinctive about human beings in order to arrive at what I think is a plausible account of the human good, that the human good involves constructing a practical identity which allows you to value yourself. Thank you.
Now, I think we still have some time for a couple of questions. Please raise your hands if you have one. Jeremy.
Thank you for this. So, do you want Aristotle or do you want Plato?
Aristotle.
Okay, so this is a friendly criticism. I was wondering if you're familiar with Arya Constance's work on the activity of being. Because I think that there are some things in his kind of forms that can help what you're saying about forms. Particularly because you're putting more in the forms than most people think. Most people think that there's a how aspect to your form.
Yeah.
So for Arya, a form is an
Thank you.
a form is an activity. So what it matter takes the activity of
Oh, I see.
taking a form, and that results in substance or being.
Yes, Aristotle goes through when he talks about form, he goes through a sequence of different definitions which get more and more sort of metaphysically interesting as he goes along. He starts with simply the arrangement of, he starts with simply something like shape or contour. Then he goes to the arrangement of the parts. Then he begins to talk about how form is actually constituted by the activities you perform. And eventually, there's sort of a being who is pure activity, who is God in Aristotle's universe. So in form and activity ultimately get identified. And I do think that that helps my case in the long run, although it's a big business to talk about it all.
Just asking if this concept of
I'm
form...
not here. There,
Sorry.
that's better.
I'm just asking if this concept of form and what form does, which are intimately connected and seem to be the same thing or a part of it, are an essentialist view of being, of a concept. A thing is in itself because it has specific properties and it cannot change them.
Can you help me out with this?
Sorry.
I'm not.
If I understood this correctly, then the question is whether or not the idea of tying the idea of good form to being's form has essentialist consequences. Is that?
Or features?
Well, it certainly it does in a way identify the essential properties of a thing. I don't think it has essentialist consequences in any objectionable sense.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. Is it fair to say you are proposing a reductive analysis of the good by saying good is to be adequate to fulfill a function, and to fulfill a function is a subordinate notion to the purpose. So for a thing for something to be good to one thing is to be adequate to its purpose, to do it well, and we go up to the human being, where the practical identity we construct to ourselves is the golden standard for which we assess what is good or which is not good. But my question is, if goodness to us is in the adequacy to that, how does we choose our practical identities? We do not have the good as a criteria for choosing our practical identity because it is instrumental to fulfill it. And unless we get in a circular or auto-referentiating, well, I'm missing the word, but unless we are circular, we don't have available the good as a criteria for the ultimate purpose, that is to choose practical identity.
Okay, I didn't address the question of how we choose practical identities in this paper. I have said a little about it in some other places. But basically, our capacity for valuing things in a cultural context gives us a set of values, and we look for some way of, for some harmony between the various things we value and our own sort of abilities and place in the world so that we can make something of ourselves that we'll think of as good. I talked a little bit towards the end of the paper about the question whether values have to be things that are shared with other people, whether you can have a value by yourself or not. I'm inclined to think you can't. And one of the reasons for it is precisely that there has to be some general consensus or harmony about what people think is valuable in order for you to choose something you yourself will think is valuable. And to want to realize your identity in that way, because certainly most of us think of being valuable in terms of living a life that's valuable to others as well as to ourselves.
Good afternoon, Professor Korsgaard. Thank you so much for your lecture about what being good and living a good life. And I would like to ask that nowadays there are still some regions that is suffering from the war, where the people are difficult to keep in health. And so I would like to ask that, in your opinion, maybe what is the nature and the ultimate goal of the war, and what is the relationship between the war and aesthetics? Thank you.
That's a big question.
What's the relationship between
the nature and the ultimate goal of the war, and the relationship between the war and the aesthetics?
the war?
The relationship.
The
Between
war.
the world. Oh, the world.
The war, peace and war. The war.
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking.
The war. The fighting. The war.
But why should there be a relationship between
The war and aesthetics. The beauty, the aesthetics. No.
Oh, aesthetics. Okay. I didn't talk about that specifically here, but the view that I'm discussing actually does have some particular ramifications for aesthetics, because part of the reason why I'm looking at the question of the human good in terms of the question of what's good for human beings is because I actually think that good for is the most basic notion in this area, that it's actually more basic than the notion of good. And if you think that, you are also committed to the view that aesthetic beauty has to have some reference to human nature, that things are beautiful in a way for us rather than just in themselves. I think aesthetic beauty is the case that most tempts people in some respects to thinking there's such a thing as just being good in itself, and you just sort of look at it and see that it's good. But I'm committed to the view that aesthetic beauty, like other forms of goodness, has to answer to something in our nature.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
My question is a really quick one. So at some point in your talk, you said that something like purpose only gains meaning from the perspective of agency. I'd like to ask you if it's not the case that the opposite is true, that agency only gains meaning with the conception of purpose, the theological conception of agency. And I think this is related to alternative translations and understandings of what ergon means, which is not necessarily just function, but work and achievement, or a work that only gains meaning with achievement. I'd like to know how you respond to the alternative translation of ergon, for example, from Samuel Baker. And I think there was a question over there, but...
Well, since I think function is not just what a thing does, but how it does what it does, and has reference to the way in which a thing operates, I think that it's a much more detailed translation of ergon than just work or activity, which might even more than function be confused just with purpose. What's your work, your activity, what do you do? And it seems to me the advantage of the more detailed conception of function is precisely, or at least one of the advantages is, that when you explain that something has a function, you're explaining in a quite specific way why it can be good or bad of its kind, its virtues make it good at its function, its vices make it bad at its function, and you're also explaining how it is that it has a good, because something has a good if certain conditions and activities can promote its well-functioning. So it just seems to me that better to use a more detailed explanation that also does some of the work that Aristotle himself thinks that it does. I mean, that's why Aristotle goes looking for the function of a human being, is in order to explain what the human good is. So if we couldn't use the notion to explain that, it wouldn't be of any use in this context.
Are you up for one last question?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So good evening, thank you for this lecture. I actually have two questions. One, okay, I'll go to the important one because this really bothers me a bit. So the notion of human good, that our practical identity, it seemed to be that it is subjective, kind of, because it can vary from person to person. And
yes.
So it is yeah, that's it.
Well, it's subjective in the sense that it can vary from person to person. But as I said in response to an earlier question, I am imagining that human beings have a set of shared values that are at least intersubjective. I'm not much of a fan of objectivity as such in this department, but values that are intersubjective and shared with others. And so in that sense, it's like there's a world of value when you ask yourself, where can I fit in? How can I be a positive part of this world? And what's subjective is the part that's just about you, but what's objective is that there's a world of values that you're trying to fit yourself into.
Okay, so I think we have to wrap things up. Thanks everyone, and let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
Bom, então queria agradecer a todos a vossa presença, dizer que as Lisbon Lectures vão continuar, agradecer ao professor João Dionísio que tem organizado estas conferências e que vai em breve passar a pasta, e agradecer finalmente de novo à professora Christine Korsgaard por esta lição tão desafiante. Muito obrigado.